The strangest thing about fate is that it never announces itself when it arrives. I had worked at Bellissimo for almost 2 years, and if you asked any customer whether they remembered me, most of them probably would not. That was fine with me. Being unnoticed made life easier. It meant fewer questions, fewer conversations, fewer chances for people to wonder where I came from or why my mother still insisted on teaching me phrases from a tiny village most Americans had never heard of. Every evening followed the same routine. I tied my apron, checked my order pad, greeted customers, and disappeared into the background while the city carried on around me. Bellissimo sat in the heart of downtown Chicago, surrounded by glass towers and expensive cars. The restaurant attracted politicians, executives, celebrities, and people whose watches cost more than my monthly rent. I treated them all the same. Smile, take the order, deliver the food, wish them a good evening, then move on. That Thursday started no differently. Rain tapped softly against the windows while golden light reflected from crystal glasses and polished wood. The dinner rush arrived exactly on schedule. Every table filled within 30 minutes. Conversations blended together into a familiar rhythm. Plates moved through the dining room. Wine bottles appeared and disappeared. Another ordinary night. At least that was what I thought. Around 7 o'clock, I noticed something unusual. The hostess suddenly straightened her posture. The manager emerged from his office. 2 servers immediately began whispering. Attention spread across the restaurant so quickly that even customers seemed to notice. I looked toward the entrance. The front doors opened. 3 men entered. The first wore a dark tailored coat and carried himself with quiet confidence. The second was older, silver-haired, moving more slowly but commanding even more attention. The third appeared to be security. I did not recognize them immediately. Several members of the staff clearly did. The manager hurried forward personally. That never happened. Curious, I watched from across the room. Then I heard one of the servers whisper a name. Moretti. The realization explained everything. Ethan Moretti. Even people who avoided news and gossip knew that name. Powerful, influential, respected, feared by some. The kind of man who made an entire room pay attention simply by walking through the door. Yet it was not Ethan who caught my attention. It was the older gentleman beside him. There was something familiar in his eyes. Something I could not explain. The hostess seated them at a private table near the windows. Moments later, the manager approached me. My stomach tightened immediately. "Grace," he said, "you are serving table 12 tonight." I glanced toward the private section. Table 12. The Morettis. Wonderful. Every instinct told me to ask someone else to take the assignment. Instead, I nodded politely and picked up 3 menus. As I walked across the dining room, rain continued sliding down the windows. The older man looked out into the darkness beyond the glass. Ethan studied something on his phone. Neither noticed me approaching. I stopped beside the table, offered my usual smile, and opened my mouth to greet them. The moment the first words left my lips, the entire course of my life began to change. "Good evening. Welcome to Bellissimo." The words left my mouth exactly the way they always did. Polite, professional, routine. Yet the reaction was anything but routine. The older gentleman's hand stopped halfway to the menu. His eyes lifted slowly toward mine. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Perhaps I had spoken too quietly. Perhaps he had not heard me. Then I noticed something strange. The entire expression on his face changed. Not anger, not confusion, recognition. The kind of recognition people experience when they unexpectedly hear a song they have not heard in decades. I stood frozen beside the table holding my order pad. Ethan Moretti glanced up from his phone and immediately noticed his father's reaction. He looked from the older man to me and back again. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Around us, the restaurant continued moving. Glasses clinked. Conversations flowed. Servers crossed the dining room, carrying trays. Yet somehow table 12 felt completely separate from everything else. Finally, the older gentleman spoke. His voice sounded calm, but his eyes remained fixed on mine. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" The question caught me completely off guard. I blinked. "Like what, sir?" He leaned back slightly. "That accent." I almost laughed. Nobody had ever asked me that before. Most people did not even notice it. If they did, they assumed it came from a relative or a family habit. "My mother," I replied. "She always spoke that way at home." The older man's fingers tightened around the edge of the menu. Ethan watched him carefully now. Whatever was happening, it clearly was not normal. Your mother taught you? The older man asked. I nodded. Since I was a child. His gaze drifted away for a second. Not toward the restaurant. Not toward Ethan. Somewhere much farther away. As if he were looking through time instead of space. Then he smiled faintly. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone remembering something precious. I have not heard that accent in a very long time, he said quietly. I was not sure how to respond, so I simply smiled politely and prepared to take their order. The conversation ended there, at least on the surface. Throughout the evening, however, I kept noticing the older man watching me whenever I approached the table. Not in an uncomfortable way, more like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Ethan noticed it too. Several times, I caught him studying me with the same curiosity. Hours passed. The dinner crowd slowly thinned. Rain continued falling outside the windows. Shortly before dessert, I delivered fresh coffee to the table. As I set down the cups, the older gentleman asked another question. What is your last name? I looked up. Harper. The effect was immediate. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The older man's face lost all color. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he placed the cup back onto the table without taking a sip. Harper, he repeated softly. That is impossible. And for the first time that night, I began to wonder whether my family was carrying a story nobody had ever told me. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I continued serving tables, refilling glasses, delivering desserts, and clearing plates, but my attention kept drifting back to table 12. Every time I approached, I found Vincent Moretti watching me with the same distant expression. Not suspicious, not uncomfortable, thoughtful, almost emotional. Ethan Moretti seemed equally unsettled. Several times, I noticed him studying his father instead of the menu or the room around him. By the time the restaurant began closing, I had convinced myself that the entire situation was nothing more than a strange coincidence. Maybe Vincent had known another Harper years ago. Maybe someone from his past spoke with a similar accent. Chicago was a large city. Stranger things had happened. Then the manager appeared beside me while I was folding napkins near the service station. Grace, he said quietly. The gentleman from table 12 would like to speak with you before he leaves. My stomach tightened immediately. I glanced toward the dining room. Most of the guests had already gone home. Chairs were being stacked. Lights had dimmed slightly. Near the windows, the Morettis remained seated. Waiting. I walked toward them, trying not to appear nervous. Vincent stood as I approached. For a man in his 70s, he carried himself with remarkable dignity. His silver hair reflected the soft restaurant lighting. Ethan remained seated but watched carefully. Neither man seemed interested in small talk. Vincent spoke first. Grace, may I ask you something personal? I hesitated before nodding. Of course. He studied my face for several seconds. Your mother? Where was she born? The question surprised me again. A small village overseas, I answered. She moved to the United States when she was young. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you know the name of the village? I did. My mother mentioned it often. Growing up, she treated the place almost like a fairy tale. A forgotten piece of family history preserved through stories, recipes, songs, and the accent she never completely lost. I told him the name. The reaction was immediate. Vincent lowered himself slowly back into his chair. Ethan's expression changed as well. Neither man spoke for several moments. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows behind them. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Father. Vincent looked toward him but seemed unable to find the right words. Then his gaze returned to me. There were fewer than 300 people living in that village when I was young, he said quietly. I have not heard anyone mention it in decades. A chill moved through me. The coincidence suddenly felt much larger than coincidence. Vincent reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed an old leather wallet. Carefully, almost reverently, he unfolded a small photograph protected by worn plastic. Time had faded the colors. The edges looked decades old. He stared at the picture before handing it toward me. My breath caught instantly. A young woman stood smiling beside a stone house. She looked remarkably familiar. The same eyes, the same smile, the same shape of her face. She looked exactly like my mother when she was younger. I slowly looked up from the photograph. Vincent Moretti was already watching my reaction. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Grace, what is your mother's full name? For a moment, I could not answer. The photograph remained in my hands while my heart pounded loud enough to drown out every sound in the restaurant. The woman in the picture looked so much like my mother that it felt impossible. I stared at the faded image again before finally looking up at Vincent Moretti. Ethan remained silent, watching both of us carefully. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle mist, and the restaurant around us had nearly emptied. It felt as though the entire world had narrowed to one table and one question. I swallowed slowly. "Her name is Eleanor Harper," I said. The reaction was immediate. Vincent closed his eyes. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just a quiet movement filled with decades of emotion. When he opened them again, they were shining. Ethan leaned forward. "Father, who is she?" Vincent looked at the photograph before answering. "She was the bravest person I ever knew." Neither Ethan nor I spoke. Vincent carefully took the photograph back and held it in both hands. For several moments, he seemed lost in memories that existed long before either of us entered the world. Finally, he looked toward me again. "Your mother once saved my life," he said softly. The words hung in the air between us. I almost laughed from disbelief. My mother worked at a community library. She spent her weekends gardening and helping neighbors. Nothing about her life suggested she had crossed paths with someone like Vincent Moretti. "There must be some mistake," I said. Vincent slowly shook his head. "There is no mistake." His voice remained calm, but the certainty behind it was impossible to ignore. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time that evening, even he appeared genuinely surprised. Vincent began explaining. Decades earlier, when he was a young man, he had spent time in the small village my mother called home. During a difficult winter, an unexpected accident had left him stranded far from help. According to Vincent, my mother and her family had taken him in, cared for him, and helped him recover. They asked for nothing in return. They simply helped because someone needed help. As he spoke, details emerged that matched stories I had heard throughout my childhood. The old stone bridge, the church bell tower, the orchard overlooking the valley. Places my mother described so often that I felt as though I had visited them myself. My disbelief slowly gave way to astonishment. Somehow, this stranger knew them all. Then Vincent said something that changed everything again. "After I returned home, I spent years trying to find your family." I frowned. "Why?" His expression softened. "Because I made a promise." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Clearly, this was the first time he had heard any of this as well. Vincent reached into his coat pocket once more. This time he removed a folded piece of yellowed paper. The edges were worn with age. The paper had clearly been opened and closed countless times over the years. He placed it carefully on the table between us. "I have carried this for more than 30 years, he said quietly. I stared at the old letter without touching it. Then Vincent looked directly into my eyes and spoke the words that made my breath catch. "Grace, I believe this letter was meant for your family." My eyes remained fixed on the letter resting between us. The paper looked fragile enough to fall apart if handled carelessly. The edges had turned yellow with age. Tiny creases covered the surface like a map of every year it had spent hidden away. For several seconds, nobody moved. The restaurant had almost completely emptied now. Somewhere in the distance, I heard staff finishing their closing duties. Yet none of that seemed important anymore. Vincent gently pushed the letter toward me. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "It belongs with your family." My fingers hesitated before touching the paper. The moment I unfolded it, I noticed the handwriting. Elegant, careful, old-fashioned. Every line had been written with intention. The letter was addressed to Eleanor and the Harper family. My mother's name. Seeing it written there made the entire situation suddenly feel real. I began reading. The letter described gratitude, respect, a promise that one day the writer would repay a debt that could never truly be measured. The words were simple, yet deeply personal. Whoever had written them had clearly carried genuine affection for my family. Halfway through the page, I looked up. "You wrote this?" Vincent nodded slowly. 32 years ago. Ethan remained silent, his attention fixed entirely on his father. I continued reading. The letter mentioned the winter Vincent had spoken about. It described a young man arriving in the village frightened and exhausted. It described my grandparents opening their home without asking questions. It described my mother sharing meals with him and translating conversations when he struggled with the local language. Details filled the page. Real memories. Real people. Real kindness. By the time I reached the final paragraph, my vision had blurred slightly. The last sentence stopped me completely. "If fate is kind, I hope our paths cross again before either of us grows old." Slowly, I lowered the letter. Vincent offered a sad smile. Fate took longer than I expected. None of us spoke for a moment. Then Ethan leaned forward. Father, why was it never delivered? Vincent looked down at the table. For the first time that evening, he seemed uncertain. Because I lost contact with them. His voice carried genuine regret. The village changed. Families moved away. Records disappeared. I searched for years. Then life carried me in other directions. He paused before continuing. But I never forgot. I believed him. Not because of his words. Because of the way he looked at the letter. Some memories fade. Others become part of who we are. This clearly belonged to the second kind. I carefully folded the paper and handed it back. My mother needs to see this. Vincent nodded immediately. I was hoping you would say that. Ethan finally spoke again. Does your mother know any of this? I shook my head. Not that I am aware of. The answer seemed to surprise all three of us. If my mother knew, she had never mentioned it. Not once. Vincent glanced toward the dark windows. The rain had finally stopped. Chicago's lights reflected across the wet streets outside. Then he reached into his coat one final time. This time he removed a small photograph tucked behind the letter. He placed it beside my hand. The image showed my mother standing next to a young man I immediately recognized as Vincent decades earlier. Both were smiling. Then I noticed something else. Standing behind them was another man. A man whose face had been partially torn from the photograph. Vincent stared at the damaged image before quietly saying the words that changed everything again. Grace, there is one person in that picture your mother may never have told you about. The damaged photograph remained on the table between us. I stared at the torn section for several seconds, trying to understand why someone would deliberately remove a face from an old picture. The missing figure suddenly felt more important than everyone still visible. Vincent carefully picked up the photograph and studied it beneath the restaurant lights. His expression carried the weight of memories that had been buried for decades. Ethan remained unusually quiet. The farther this story unfolded, the more questions seemed to appear. Finally, I looked at Vincent. Who was he? Vincent did not answer immediately. Instead, he traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. Someone your mother cared about very deeply. My heart skipped. I thought about every story my mother had ever told me. Family gatherings, childhood memories, the village, the journey to America. Yet somehow there had never been a man in those stories. Not once. I do not understand, I admitted. Vincent nodded slowly. Neither did I for many years. He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the darkened windows. Beyond the glass, Chicago shimmered beneath reflections from wet streets and distant headlights. Then he began speaking. The man in the photograph had been one of his closest friends when they were young. They had spent months together in the village. According to Vincent, everyone expected him and my mother to build a future together. The entire village knew it. The families knew it. Even Vincent had believed it would happen. I listened carefully, struggling to connect this story with the woman I knew. My mother rarely spoke about her personal past. Whenever I asked questions about her younger years, she would smile and change the subject. At the time, I assumed she simply preferred privacy. Now I wondered if something else had been hiding beneath that silence. Vincent continued. Then one day his friend left unexpectedly. Not because he wanted to. Because circumstances forced him to leave. Promises were made. Letters were exchanged. Plans were discussed. Yet somehow the years passed, and those plans never became reality. What happened to him? I asked. Vincent's eyes returned to the photograph. That is the question nobody could answer. The words settled heavily between us. Ethan folded his arms. You mean he disappeared? Vincent nodded. As far as anyone knew. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Larger. More complicated. I looked down at the image again. The torn space where the man's face should have been now seemed strangely deliberate. Almost protective. Why remove him from the picture? I asked quietly. Vincent exhaled slowly. I never knew. Then something occurred to me. Does my mother know you have this photograph? Vincent shook his head. Not unless she recognized me all those years ago and chose to remain silent. Somehow that possibility felt unlikely. My mother would never have hidden something so significant without reason. Yet every answer only created more uncertainty. The restaurant manager finally approached and politely informed us that the staff needed to finish closing. Hours had passed without any of us noticing. Vincent carefully returned the photograph and letter to his coat pocket. Then he stood. Grace, he said gently. I think it is time your mother and I spoke again. I nodded, still trying to process everything I had learned. Then Vincent said one final thing before leaving. Because there is a reason that face was removed from the photograph. His eyes met mine. And I believe your mother may be the only person alive who knows why. The next morning felt unreal. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the damaged photograph, the faded letter, and the expression on Vincent Moretti's face when he spoke my mother's name. By noon, my shift at the restaurant felt completely insignificant compared to the questions filling my mind. When I finally arrived at my mother's small house on the edge of the city, I carried copies of the photograph Vincent had allowed me to take. The winter sunlight filtered through the kitchen window exactly as it always had. Fresh flowers sat near the sink. A kettle warmed quietly on the stove. Everything looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. My mother smiled when I entered. She immediately noticed something was wrong. "Grace," she asked softly. "What happened?" I sat across from her at the kitchen table. For a moment, I could not find the right words. Then I carefully placed the photograph in front of her. The effect was immediate. Her smile vanished. The color drained from her face. She stared at the image without blinking. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Finally, her fingers touched the photograph. Gently, almost reverently. I had never seen her look at anything that way. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Her voice sounded different. Older somehow. I explained everything. The restaurant. Vincent Moretti. The accent. The letter. The questions. I told her every detail. She listened without interrupting. By the time I finished, tears had appeared in her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind people carry when memories return unexpectedly. "You know him?" I said. It was not a question anymore. My mother nodded slowly. "Yes." The answer felt like the first piece of a much larger puzzle. She looked down at the photograph again. I never thought I would see his face again. I waited. Eventually she began speaking. The village Vincent described had once been her entire world. Everyone knew everyone. Families shared meals. Neighbors helped one another. Life was simple. During those years, Vincent and his friend spent time there. According to my mother, the friend quickly became part of the community. He was kind, intelligent, curious about everything. Her expression softened as she remembered him. Then I asked the question that had haunted me all night. Who was the man whose face was removed? My mother's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, something had changed. A decision had been made. She stood from the table and walked toward an old cabinet in the corner of the room. After searching for a moment, she returned carrying a small wooden box. The box looked ancient. Scratches covered the surface. The hinges had darkened with age. She placed it carefully on the table between us. "I promised myself I would never open this again," she said quietly. My heart pounded. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside were letters, photographs, small keepsakes preserved for decades. At the very bottom rested another photograph. This one was intact. My mother picked it up and handed it to me. The moment I saw the image, I understood why she had hidden it for so long. The missing face from Vincent's photograph was clearly visible here. And standing beside him was my mother. Both were smiling. Both looked deeply connected. Then my mother spoke the words that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. "Grace," she said softly, "the man in that photograph was supposed to become your father." The photograph trembled slightly in my hands. I looked from the image to my mother and back again, hoping somehow I had misunderstood what she had just said. But the sadness in her eyes left no room for doubt. The man whose face had been removed from Vincent's photograph had once been the person she expected to spend her life with. Suddenly, every unanswered question from the past 24 hours felt connected. Every letter, every photograph, every silence. My mother sat quietly across from me, her fingers resting on the edge of the wooden box. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I finally found my voice. "What happened?" She lowered her gaze toward the old photographs spread across the table. Sunlight drifted through the kitchen window, illuminating decades of memories that had remained hidden until now. "We were very young," she began softly. "The world felt much smaller then." Her smile appeared briefly before fading again. She explained that the man in the photograph had arrived in the village several months before Vincent left. At first, he was simply a visitor. Then he became a friend. Eventually, he became something more. According to my mother, everyone expected them to marry one day. Even their families believed it was only a matter of time. She showed me letters he had written. Some described dreams of the future. Others contained simple observations about daily life. Every page revealed genuine affection, genuine hope. Then everything changed. One day he left the village unexpectedly. He promised he would return. He promised he would write. For a while, he did both. Then the letters stopped arriving. Weeks became months. Months became years. Nobody knew what had happened. No explanation ever came. Did you ever find out why? I asked. My mother slowly shook her head. No. The answer carried a sadness that time had never fully erased. She looked down at one particular photograph and gently touched the corner. For a long time, I thought something terrible must have happened. Her voice remained calm, but I could hear the weight behind it. Eventually, I accepted that some questions never receive answers. I glanced toward the wooden box. Then why keep all of this? A small smile returned to her face. Because forgetting is not the same as healing. The words lingered between us. Suddenly I understood why she had preserved every letter, every photograph, every memory. Not because she lived in the past, because the past had helped shape the person she became. Then another thought occurred to me. Does Vincent know all of this? My mother looked surprised. Not completely. She paused. At least I do not think so. That answer immediately sparked new questions. If Vincent had spent decades searching for her family, perhaps he had been searching for answers too. Perhaps this story remained unfinished for more than one person. My mother carefully returned several photographs to the box. Then she stopped when she reached the bottom. Beneath the letters rested a sealed envelope. Unlike the others, it looked untouched. She stared at it silently. What is that? I asked. Her expression changed. Not sadness this time. Uncertainty. Slowly, she picked up the envelope and turned it over. Written on the front was a name I had never heard before. The handwriting matched the old letters. My mother's eyes widened slightly. Then she whispered something that made my heart stop. This was supposed to be delivered after he returned. She looked directly at me. But he never came back. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The sealed envelope rested in my mother's hands like a piece of time that had somehow survived untouched. The sunlight coming through the kitchen window illuminated the faded paper, revealing creases and marks left by decades of waiting. I stared at it while my mother carefully traced the handwriting with her fingertips. I never opened it, she whispered. I promised myself I never would. Her voice carried no bitterness, only acceptance, the kind that comes after living with unanswered questions for many years. I looked at her. Why keep it? She smiled faintly. Because hope is difficult to throw away. The words settled quietly between us. Then, for the first time since this story began, my mother did something unexpected. She handed me the envelope. Open it. My heart immediately began racing. The seal cracked softly beneath my fingers. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper had aged, but the writing remained clear. Together, we read it. The letter was brief. It explained that the writer had been called away unexpectedly. It spoke of obligations, responsibilities, and promises he hoped to fulfill before returning. Most importantly, it ended with a vow. No matter how long it took, he intended to come back. My mother closed her eyes as I finished reading. He never got the chance, she said softly. I looked at her in surprise. What do you mean? She reached into the wooden box once more and removed a newspaper clipping I had never seen before. The article described an accident that had occurred many years earlier in another country. The name printed in the article matched the signature on the letter. Suddenly, everything became clear. The letters had stopped not because he forgot her, not because he changed his mind, not because he abandoned the future they planned together. Life had simply moved in a direction neither of them could control. For several moments, silence filled the kitchen. Then my mother smiled through tears. Not tears of grief, tears of peace. After all these years, she finally had her answer. 2 days later, Vincent Moretti visited our home. He arrived alone. No security, no assistance, no formalities. Just an elderly man carrying memories he had protected for decades. My mother welcomed him inside. The moment they saw each other, neither spoke. They simply smiled. Years disappeared from the room. They spent hours sharing stories, photographs, and forgotten memories. Vincent returned the old letter. My mother shared the unopened envelope. Questions that had survived for more than 30 years finally received answers. As I listened, I realized something important. The true story had never been about money, influence, or power. It was about people, about promises, about kindness that survives across generations. Before Vincent left, he handed my mother one final item. A framed copy of the photograph that had started everything. This time no face had been removed. The image was complete. The story was complete. As the afternoon sunlight filled the room, Vincent looked at me and smiled. Your accent brought all of this back together. I laughed. Softly. It still sounded impossible. Yet somehow it was true. A few ordinary words spoken in a restaurant had reunited people separated by decades. That evening, after Vincent left, my mother placed the photograph beside the window where the light could reach it every morning. Then she looked at me and smiled. For the first time in my life, I understood something she had always tried to teach me. Sometimes fate does not arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives disguised as an ordinary conversation, carrying answers that have been waiting a lifetime to be heard.